Now, at the risk of setting something off, I'm going to put these paperwork down and thank everyone for coming here today. Even though it may present a challenge to the safety officer, and it's a good sign generally that we are oversubscribed. We do regret the fact that we've had to turn so many people away. This conference has really attracted an enormous amount of attention, and partly because of the work of Liam Mannix, whom you all know. He produces conferences that are about exactly what they say on the tin, in this case heritage, as an engine of economic growth in mid-sized towns. To say that a conference of this nature is timely is very much of an understatement. And while it's not focused exclusively on walled towns, we have the Irish Walled Towns Network in particular to thank for today's conference. And colleagues in UCC, William, Jonathan Hall, Brendan O'Sullivan and John Crowley, to thank in particular for helping with the organisation of the themes of this conference, the direction and where it might actually take us from here is anybody's guess, but we won't let that ball drop either. Of all of the achievements, I think, of the Irish Walled Towns Network, I personally rank as among the most important is the fact that the Irish Walled Towns Network has alerted people to the fact that walled towns exist in Ireland. You don't have to go to Britain, France, Germany, Italy or wherever to experience them. They're right here on our doorstep. But more than this, the Irish Walled Towns Network has helped focus our attention on towns in general. And so today we're not focusing on walled towns per se, they feature in the talk, but towns in general. I think we're waking up to that, and obviously from the Heritage Council's perspective to the heritage that is our towns and in our towns. Well-appointed towns whose historical character is intact and tangible have a particular ambience, as we all know, that's distinct and highly seductive. How many of us have strolled through streets of well-appointed historic towns and envied the people who live there? You know, the quirky architecture, the beautiful doorways, the ironmongery, the roof lines, the stairwells, the bijou local shops, and that personal touch, and imagined ourselves actually living there. I wonder, does that for you conjure up fond memories of holidays abroad or of towns in Ireland? I rather suspect the former, because the reality is that too many of our towns have abandoned in many ways their historic cores, or if they survive at all, it's only in patches, as you well know. For all its vibrancy and culture, the city of Galway is a very good example of this, and it pains me personally to say this because I live there and I know how much has been lost, but I know also how deeply runs the regret among people in Galway as to the scale of the loss of the medieval character of the town during the 1970s and 1980s, and it's still ongoing. I also know everybody's favourite part of town. It's obvious where people are most comfortable and at ease and at their most creative and inspirational, if you like. So my point is that Galway proves that it's not just about architecture, it's also about people. And people taking ownership of the qualities of the streets, the qualities that exist in towns, and making it their own and making it their business to look after it. The good news, I suppose, is that there is a flame that has been lit over the last number of months even, perhaps, all over Ireland. And part of our job today is to keep that flame alive by sharing the vision a little bit, and indeed by adding a little bit of hard science so that the decision makers have the stats available to them when making the case for the preservation of the historic core or character of our towns. In Ireland, the pursuit of the strip mall dream for the last 40 years has caused us to neglect the alternative town experience for so long that many of us have forgotten what it's like. Even worse, I think, it has caused us to give up on the dream of ever again having this in Ireland is a sense that the pendulum has just swung too far in the opposite direction. In short, I suppose what I'm saying is that we have allowed the big one-stop retail experience to dominate us at the expense of what towns have to offer, and the tidal wave that we're under seems to be unstoppable. In some ways, we really are closer to Berlin or to Boston rather than to Berlin. I know, of course, that there are historical reasons why this is the case and why we neglect our buildings, that circumstances and attitudes that obtained, a long time ago that are completely beyond our control existed. But today we want to focus on the here and now, on what we can do with what we have left, and how we need to reevaluate in order to imagine and realise different futures for our townscapes, in this case, mid-sized towns. We know that the historic character of towns, the older textured streetscapes, the differentiated roof lines, the fenestration, colours, ironmongery and so on, we know that this appeals to people. Such places are attractive. They encourage sightseers to amble, locally distinct businesses to trade, families, dwellers to inhabit, to set up home, for audiences to sniff out those one-off entertainment sort of venues, and shoppers to shop. Ambience encourages shoppers to shop. So it's good for us as communities, it's good for the environment, and it's good for our pockets, because it underpins local sustainable economies and contributes to the type of regional sort of distinctiveness that we all crave, not just fiscally, but naturally, spiritually as well. And we also know it that it's good for us. Now, you've heard me say this before. You've heard this phrase come out of my mouth. We know this intuitively. But now, as we're about to hear shortly, we also know it scientifically. The evidence is incontrovertible. Historic town centres that have held on to their historic buildings are des-res and des-com, if I might coin a phrase. So, in other words, they're desirable commercial venues as well. In fact, in many ways, they're des-everything. So, if we know this instinctively and scientifically, that preservation of the historic character of our towns is good, why then, every day of the week, are we ripping the character out of our towns and replacing it with buildings and streetscapes that don't inspire us, that look ugly, that are out of place, that are characterless, and are, for all those reasons, anti-community? Why are we doing this? Well, you could say that here in Ireland, as post-colonials, that we have a built-in disregard for the relics of that other history. It's a kind of paint that we apply indiscriminately to all symbols of governance and order. So maybe that's just part of who we are. Or you could say that, for example, our energies were traditionally expended on portable art, if you like, on metalwork, manuscripts, literature, music, and so on, and that we're attached more closely to the natural world than the built world. You could say that our education system is so utterly devoid of training in the aesthetics that most of the population has a complete and fatal blind spot when it comes to the built environment. Or you could say that it's a combination of all of these things, but all of these things combined and then guided, or if you like, misguided by a theory that says, if the old isn't making money, maybe the new might. Well, folks, typically it doesn't. Liam Mannix commented to me the other day that the practice of sacrificing the historic fabric of our towns for short-term development gain and a naive expectation of long-term prosperity conforms to Albert Einstein's definition of stupidity, which is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. But there's another factor: big money. International retail chains with big physical footprints and economies of scale squeeze the little guys out. They lobby harder, and so they determine the shape and conditions, the rules of the game. And whether by accident or design, they have made the Irish retail sector a pretty monotone affair. There's no doubt that such outfits are here to stay, and that they have a value and a convenience for all of us, so there's no denying that. The problem is right now that they thrive at the expense of the local and the locally distinct, which is the lifeblood of our towns. So your attendance here to me suggests that there's an awareness that striking a better balance of managing this space better will help to float all boats. Take Dundrum, for example, a hobby horse of mine, a perfectly charming, people-centred village with lovely textured streetscape, mauled, if you look, pardon the expression, mauled in the rear end in the 1970s by a shopping centre that was devoid of any architectural merit and utterly unsympathetic to its surroundings, and then decapitated in the noughties by the so-called town centre that utterly dominates what's left of the village, obliterates the view of the Three Rock Mountain, which was a feature of the main street, and perhaps worst of all, it has all but destroyed the economic and social viability of the existing local shops and streetscapes, including, ironically, the original shopping centre, which is now looking pretty sad and abandoned. Local residents, for example, for about a mile in every direction, are housebound by the traffic that this mecca to consumerism creates or generates. And if NAMA permits, Phase 2 will add another 101,000 square metres of retail space to Dundrum town centre, making it the biggest shopping centre in Europe. What then? That local businesses survive at all in Dundrum, to my mind, is a testament to the determination of local residents not to let the town centre suck the life out of the place. And so the question I ask, I don't have an answer to this, but the question I ask is, could it have been done better? Was the best integration of old and new achieved here, of big and small? I think the answer is no. Now, as I said, staff in the Heritage Council will know that I find myself personally insulted by the phrase town centre. We know in this room that towns develop organically and historically. You can't build one de novo, an interior space full of retail outlets, and think that it's even appropriate to call it a town centre, because it's the opposite of everything that a town centre should and can be. And I think it's a measure of how far off the map we have strayed. But so as I say, the staff in the Heritage Council will know, and as you can probably now guess, this is something which is a hobby horse of mine. And I admit to a personal connection. And why shouldn't I? Because isn't that what it's all about? Isn't that what we're trying to achieve today? My grandparents' beautiful period residence in Dundrum is now derelict, abandoned to drinkers, to vandals, to the elements. Its present owner, when he bought it, had plans to knock it down and turn it into apartment blocks. But his plans were thwarted by the local community, who lobbied to have it made a listed building, and successfully so, because they liked it, they understood it, they saw that it was part of the architectural heritage of Dundrum. It added to the historic ambience of the place. But we all know the story. We know how it's going to pan out. Neglect is turning the house into an eyesore, a place for antisocial behaviour, and eventually the neighbours who fought so hard to have it listed in the first place will be relieved to see it pulled down. And with that, another piece of Dundrum's architectural heritage, another piece of the jigsaw that makes it unique and an attractive place to be, will die while the local authority stands idly by. About 250 yards up the road, of course, is the airfield house. And you can see the success and the difference there. But this is happening all over the country. I think on one of my first outings as chairman of the Heritage Council, a woman approached me from Tyrrell's Pass to warn me that the same fate lay in store for the wonderful terrace of houses on the south side of the village square in Tyrrell's Pass. Neither of these are mid-sized towns, but the message is exactly the same. Old is valuable. And people like a bit of old. In fact, they regularly prefer it. So if it's really that obvious, if it's really as clear as that, why is it so hard to achieve? Well, I'm going to quote Albert Einstein back at you, Liam, and say, where he said, "Nothing is so simple it cannot be misunderstood." Liam wanted me to mention that in the latest edition, which is the 10th edition, I think, of The Lonely Planet, the towns with the most interesting historical streetscapes are consistently given the highest recommendations and the greatest coverage, with a population of about 5,163, I think. Westport gets 3 pages. Feathered, with a population of 1,400, gets a whole page to itself. And by contrast, many of the bigger market towns, which have steadily eroded their historic fabric, are largely ignored. And yet it's these market towns that are often confused as to why other places get more visitors than they do. Naturally, we all know there was a sort of mixed reaction to Lonely Planet holding up a mirror to us. Places like Slane, Navan and Kells were highly insulted at being described as blighted with soulless housing estates and hellish traffic. But if you check out the postboards, the people who were most offended, who were writing on the internet, were from abroad. Irish postboards tended to be more sanguine, and I think that's because we have a better sense of what it is that we have lost. So I'm going to read out a flavour of those, just 2 of them. Somebody who calls himself Floodsy writes, I studied in Letterkenny at one stage, then visited again about 10 years later. The town appears to have doubled in size, at least. The lovely nearby hills are covered in developments, and the soul of the place has gone. Letterkenny always seemed to me to be a town where all the local politicians were also developers, or very close to them. Planning permission was always granted without any thought of preserving the character of the place. Letterkenny is far from alone in that regard, but it seems to have outdone the excesses of many other places. And Dave, writing about Waterford, and these are string conversations, by the way, so I'm just giving you a snapshot, writes, yeah, give Waterford some love. Good, rock on, Dave. We have our own fancy bridge now, and what about all the empty shops and empty shopping centres like Railway Square and Ferrybank? They're a sight to see. According to Lonely Planet, Ireland has become, I quote, a land of motorways and multiculturalism planned and developed in between double decafe, in between the double decaf lattes and time out at the latest spa for thermal mud treatment. Now, what are the most scary words in that sentence? To me, they are planned and developed. This, folks, was planned. I know there's lots of planners here who say, I didn't plan this, but it was planned. Somebody planned this. Now, there are signs of change. People are doing it for themselves. They're reclaiming the streets. There's life in our towns again, and we're trying to make the most of what character remains. And I think we're all encouraged by the spontaneous growth in things like markets in towns, heritage foods. But, you know, and we are bringing real live people back into our towns to live in them. The problem is that most of the time we're doing this by knocking down the old historic buildings to build new properties for them, if you like, townhouses that don't mature well, that look cheap, partly because they lack in quality. I was going to finish with quoting directly from the notes that Liam sent me for this conference, and I'm going to do that, but I'm also going to quote from another recent publication. And if you won't mind me quoting it directly, Liam, because Liam has a very refreshing way of hitting the nail right on the head, and I think anyone who knows him will be aware of this and the energy and the commitment that he brings to it. I'd like to commend that while I'm here. He says, within the Irish psyche there appears to be a particular trait that likes everything to be clean. In our towns, this has had the outcome of creating well-kept and colourful facades. However, it also means that the small things that make a place interesting, such as painted wall signs, interesting ironwork, old timber windows, have been slowly yet systematically replaced and removed from the streetscape. The problem is that these actions are stunting the ability of towns to create the prosperity that everyone wants. Put simply, people like stuff. They like a sense of discovery. In both the UK and internationally, the most popular tourist districts are the ones with the most interesting facades and street life. Think of Petergate in York, Las Ramblas, and the medieval core of Barcelona. Fáilte Ireland have also recognised the desire of tourists to explore and discover for themselves what Ireland is all about, and yet the drive for clean, zero-maintenance buildings is creating sterile and uninteresting towns. The tragic thing about the compulsion to tidy up or to get rid of an old building is that the economic argument is false. There's clear evidence that the reuse of historic structures is more cost-effective than the construction of a new one, and that traditional materials have a long and more cost-effective lifespan than many modern products, such as PVC windows. Regardless, though, of the evidence, the result has been a lessening of the attractiveness of many towns, not only for tourists, but for high-end multinationals seeking a sustainable base for the mobile professionals that they employ. The point was reinforced to Liam and all of us recently at the Places Resource Conference when, and I think you're being slightly ironic here, speakers from those well-known heritage lobby groups, the World Bank and the IDA, talked about the importance to multinationals of locating in aesthetically pleasing and culturally desirable places. Certainly there are constraints in maintaining strong retail and entertainment products within historic urban centres. However, the best way to deal with these constraints is not through head-on collision methodology of typical greenfield development. Instead, it's by using heritage as a resource and converting the identified constraints into advantages. Unfortunately, though, in Ireland, the former is by far the more common scenario. Nonetheless, for most towns, that methodology has simply not worked. If it had, we wouldn't be here today. But I want to finish with a quotation from Hugh Lewis. Now, not Huey Lewis, although I'm sure in school that was what he was called. He's the Welsh Government's Minister for Housing Regeneration and Heritage. Isn't that an interesting combination? Right? And I'm going to quote from him in reverse order. He says, "We don't want to stymie development. We don't want to keep people out of owning comfortable homes, but there is a way of making sure we keep their special character as well." He's talking about historic towns. This is about locality. I wish the conference well. Very fierce pride in locality. We should build on that to engender the kind of civic pride that we can mobilise. Cadw, which is the the Welsh Heritage Board. Cadw, where did the French come from? I don't know. Cadw is now thinking as much about the communities in which the built heritage is embedded as about the assets from the past. The organisation is looking at heritage in a much more holistic way. The potential is enormous. Thank you. I wish the conference well.